Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Preemie Health Talks. This is our second talk of today, our last day of the Preemie Health Talks. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, and your host for this event. The Preemie Health Talks is the first of two international live series that CPBF is hosting 2020 in recognition of World Prematurity Day. Next month, I'll be hosting Preemie Power Week, and all the information is already available on our website. These educational sessions are in collaboration with the International Family Integrated Care Committee, the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses, EFCNI, and GLANS, the Global Alliance for Newborn Care. For those not familiar with CPBF, we are a charitable organization, and our mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies every step of the way. We believe that through consistent information, access to helpful resources, and peer support inside and outside the NICU, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their baby. Consistent information is especially important today when we are facing a global pandemic. With the Preemie Health Talks and the Preemie Power Week, we intend to bring you the guidance of healthcare professionals and the knowledge gathered by researchers around the world, which are extremely valuable to help us care for families and their babies. I want to thank AbbVie for the unrestricted educational grant, Pearce, and our amazing team who worked really hard to make this week possible. And today we already had one session with Dr. Paige Church that will be recorded and available on our website. That was recorded, sorry, and available on our website next week. Now I have Rebecca Pearce, and after Rebecca, I have Dr. Rudena Banihani from Sunnybrook. And we're going to talk about the preemies and school, a parent and teacher perspective. Rebecca will discuss her observations and insights about preemies and the school environment from a teacher, preemie mother, educational researcher point of view. Rebecca Pearce is a mother of Maureen, I'm sorry if I mispronounced her name, who was born at 25 weeks gestational in 2009. She's a long-time member of the Family Advisory Committee at Saint-Justine, which is a group of veteran parents in Montreal, Quebec, who act as a resource for families new to the NICU and who contribute to improving clinical care, research, and teaching by offering a critical parental viewpoint. Rebecca has published several opinion pieces about existing outcomes research fails to meet the needs of parents of preterm children. Rebecca is a secondary science teacher in Montreal and is a third-year PhD on the department, PhD candidate, right, Rebecca? In the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill University, where she's studying preterm children as mathematical learners and doers. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us here today. I know you're super busy at the middle of your school day, so I appreciate taking the time to join us here.
Thanks. Thank you, Fabiana. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to turn off my video. You can hear me? It's all good?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Well, I would first like to thank Fabiana and the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation for organizing this fantastic week of talks and for giving me the opportunity to present to you today. And of course, thank you so much for all of you out there who are taking the time to listen. So as Fabiana already, she gave me a fantastic introduction. You took all the stuff I was going to say, which is fine. But my name is Rebecca Pearce. I'm not a medical professional, but rather an educator and an educational researcher. As Fabiana mentioned, I've been a secondary science teacher in Montreal for the past 15 years. And I'm currently actually I'm starting my fourth year PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education at McGill. Perhaps most importantly, I'm also the mom to Marin, who's an 11-year-old young lady who was born extremely preterm at 25 weeks gestational age in 2009. Marin was a very sick baby and had a number of medical issues that your children may have also experienced. She had serious bacterial and fungal infections, required surgery for a PDA ligation, and also developed severe bronchopulmonary dysplasia that required her to be on a ventilator for 7 weeks and need supplemental oxygen at home for a short period of time. She had a brain bleed that damaged part of her cerebellum and was in the NICU for a total of 4 months. I'm happy to report that despite all of these challenges, today Marin is a happy, healthy, lovely child, although she is experiencing some struggles in school. So this is one of the main reasons that I'm here today to speak with you about preemies in school from a parent and educator perspective. So from reading the description of the talks from this week, it seems like many of you out there are the parents of children born preterm who are still babies, toddlers, or young children. When I was thinking about how to structure this talk, I considered the fact that Maren and I are probably further along in our journey than many of you out there. I thought about what I, as a parent, would have liked to know about school, education, and prematurity when Maren was younger. So these are the topics I'll be touching on for the next 20 minutes or so during my presentation. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of preterm birth and its prevalence, as well as some of the general outcomes of preterm birth. I will then look at what the research tells us about how children who are born preterm do in school. Just to give you a heads up, the research about this is not super positive, which is why I will also be presenting some good news. I will address some gaps in knowledge translation and talk about some important considerations that parents of preterm children should keep in mind as you navigate the school system. Finally, I'll show some resources and talk about potential future research. And throughout all of this, I will map out some of our personal experiences with Maren and school. So as many of you know, preterm birth is defined at birth below 37 weeks gestational age, and it can be divided into late preterm birth between 32 and 37 weeks, or moderate to late, very preterm birth at between 28 and 32 weeks gestational age, and extremely preterm birth at less than 28 weeks gestational age. I mention this because babies that are born very and extremely preterm are the most fragile, the most likely to experience medical problems and have long hospital stays, and all of this contributes to the educational difficulties they can later experience. This means that most studies involving preemies in education involve very or extremely preterm children because they are the ones most likely to have the most complications arising from their birth. However, I think it's very important to point out that even moderate to late preterm children experience more difficulties in school than children born at term. About 10% of births in Canada are preterm, and about 1% are below 28 weeks, so extremely preterm. So the major negative impacts of preterm birth involve neurosensory impairments, including cerebral palsy, blindness, deafness, and intellectual disability. However, a minority of children are impacted by these outcomes. What is perhaps just as important, but less discussed, are the other less well-known impacts, particularly with respect to education and socialization, that make preterm children a higher risk group in schools. So these are referred to as minor morbidities of prematurity, morbidities that are considered highly prevalent, but less severe than major neurosensory impairments. So just as an example, low borderline IQ, learning and attention problems such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or learning disabilities, and behavior and emotional problems occur in 50 to 70% of extremely preterm children. I still remember right before Maren's discharge from the NICU, speaking to one of our neonatologists about how well Maren was doing, all things considered. And he gently said to me something like, you know, there's going to be something that comes up with her at some point. He never used the words minor morbidities of prematurity, but that's really what he meant, that given her gestational age and her medical history, it was highly likely that something, whether problems with learning and attention or whatever, would arise at some point. So what are some of these minor morbidities and how can they impact on schooling for preterm children? With respect to psychosocial outcomes, there's something called the preterm behavioral phenotype, which can include inattention, anxiety, and social and communication problems, but also a lower risk of children acting out or exhibiting hyperactivity and impulsivity. What this means is that some preterm children may fall through the cracks in school because they're very quiet and not disruptive, so less likely to show behavior that teachers may view as concerning. In adolescence, preterm children may be socially shy and withdrawn and engage in less risk-taking behavior, for example, drinking or taking drugs. Finally, preterm children may have clinical problems with attention. In one study, extremely preterm children were more than 5 times more likely than term-born peers to be diagnosed with ADHD than classmates, with the greatest risk for ADHD inattentive subtype. So this can manifest as children making careless mistakes in classwork, missing important details, having trouble following instructions, or appearing forgetful or distracted. So an important thing to remember is that preterm children don't really catch up to their term-born classmates. It's impossible to get back those weeks or months of gestation and brain development that were lost through preterm birth. The second important take-home message is that preterm children are much more likely than their term-born peers to show complex and unique learning differences that may mean they have trouble in school. The lower the gestational age at birth, the more likely this is. For example, research has suggested that over 50% of extremely preterm children born in Western countries have some serious educational problems. So this shows up as educational attainment below term-born peers, an increased need for special education resources and assistance in schools, and more students with IEPs or individual education plans. And these difficulties continue into adolescence. There are some clear patterns with respect to these problems. As a group, preterm children achieve lower marks in school and also lower scores on standardized tests in reading, math, and spelling in both elementary and secondary school. With respect to higher order skills, the most recent meta-analysis of research shows preterm children have significant difficulties in reading comprehension and in solving applied math problems. Interestingly, math is a particular issue for many preterm children, and they tend to score worse on standardized math tests than would be expected. Now, many of you out there might not think this is such a big deal based on your past experiences in school. I know as a teacher, I've heard a number of parents say, oh, I was always terrible at math, but I'm successful and I'm doing fine now. But the reality is that more and more, there's a considerable emphasis placed on math in school, and an inability to demonstrate success in school math can limit students' choices. We have definitely seen this with Marin. She's always had difficulty or struggled with mathematics, and this has become even more pronounced as she has transitioned from grade to grade, particularly as the math has become more demanding and now involves complex multi-step problem solving. Executive functioning skills probably play a big role in why preterm children may struggle in school. So on top of problems with attention, preterm children as a group have slower processing speed and poorer working memory that can impact on academic performance. I also wonder whether these weak EF skills might link to some of the anxiety and shyness that are part of the preterm phenotype. For example, if you have a slower processing speed, it might be difficult for you to follow conversations in a classroom or on the playground. Again, we see some of this in our daughter. Marin doesn't like to talk in class or to participate in class discussions, and she prefers to play with 1 or 2 children rather in a big group. So these executive functioning problems can make it more difficult for children to pay attention, to plan, to remember, to complete multiple tasks, and to organize themselves. And these are all skills that underlie academic success in schools. So what's the good news? A lot of the information that I just delivered could be pretty heavy or upsetting. I hope that no parents out there are freaking out, because there is good news about children born preterm. The problem is that it tends to get lost in the negative noise. There's a great quote in a paper that was written by doctors Mai Liu and Anne-Monique Nui, who are 2 clinician scientists from Saint-Justine in Montreal, that reads, "A deficit in cognitive functioning is not disabling if it does not limit personal activity and social participation." So what this means that if your child is a slow learner or having problems in school, it is not the end of the world, and it does not preclude them from being happy and functional members of society. And this really should be our focus. There is a huge emphasis on IQ and cognitive scores in outcome research that doesn't capture the high functional capacity of preterm children, adults, and adolescents. A lot of the research that is, I would say most of the research, in fact, that is done is not based on perspectives of preterm individuals, but rather on the perspectives of health professionals who may have very different values and care about very different outcomes. More recent research has actually looked at the self-reported quality of life and functioning in former preemies. Some important take-home information is that most teenagers born preterm have the same self-reported self-esteem as term peers, have fewer behavioral problems, have a high health-related quality of life, though they may experience more anxiety. So while prematurity is associated with adverse educational outcomes, preterm children show amazing resilience, and as adults, the vast majority live fulfilling and productive lives. So what's the bad news? In Montreal, at the hospital where my daughter was born, most preterm children are only followed by a developmental pediatrician until the age of 5. And this is variable depending on the medical center or the province in which you live. Basically, after this, responsibility for follow-up in children falls on the education system and on parents. The statistics that I presented at the beginning of this talk about the number of preterm births in Canada suggest that there are likely to be at least 1 or 2 preterm children in every classroom. We also know from the considerable research that preterm children are a vulnerable group. So you would think that all teachers or educational professionals would be aware that preterm children in their classes may struggle in school. Unfortunately, the answer to this statement is mostly no. I think that there are also a number of parents out there that are unaware of the fact that their preterm child, especially if that child was born very or extremely preterm, is at a higher risk of academic difficulty. I was recently introduced to the term knowledge translation, which is the way in which academic research, like all of the decades of studies about preterm children and education, are put to practical use or are disseminated to the people who can actually apply it, for example, teachers. Unfortunately, there seems to have been very little knowledge translation when it comes to preemies in school. There are two important studies that highlight this enormous gap. The first was conducted in 2015 by Dr. Samantha Johnson, a developmental psychologist in the UK. She looked at questionnaires filled in by almost 600 teachers and over 200 educational psychologists, and found that very few of them knew about the most common outcomes of preterm birth in school, such as shyness, anxiety, and difficulty with mathematics. Very few participants had received any information or formal training about prematurity and school. The second study was published in 2019 and was conducted in Ontario by Dr. Paige Church, who was the woman who spoke before me, and it also found very similar results. Only 12% of Canadian teachers felt that they were very knowledgeable about the outcomes of preterm birth and how they can be managed in the classroom. While most educators expressed comfort teaching a child born preterm, less than half said that they would be comfortable teaching a child with educational challenges. So this is quite problematic because many preterm children are going to have educational challenges. Most parents were upfront with their child's school or educator about the fact that their child was preterm, and the teachers were happy to have this information. But parents also didn't feel that their child's teachers were knowledgeable about the learning challenges faced by preterm children. This really mirrors our personal experience with Marin. We were upfront and open with all of her teachers, starting even in daycare, but certainly in kindergarten, about her prematurity, but none of them had any knowledge about how that might impact her academically or what to do with this information. Again, this isn't really their fault. There just hasn't been any attempt for knowledge translation to occur between hospitals and researchers and teachers or other educational professionals. So what does this mean for all you parents that are out there listening? So I guess this talk is a start, but do a bit of reading on this topic or have a discussion with your child's developmental pediatrician to see what they have to say about preterm children in school and any concerns you may have. You may need to be the one to educate your child's teacher about educational outcomes of preterm birth. Keep in mind that monitoring, awareness, early referral, and focused intervention are so important to make sure that preterm children have the best support possible in school. Recent research has suggested that even if preterm children are healthy physically and have cognitive scores in the normal range, it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't experience difficulties. So if you notice something that seems concerning with your child, even if they haven't started school, it might not just be a maturational delay, but a real issue to be explored. Preterm children should be monitored and screened for emotional communication and behavior disorders that are part of the preterm phenotype. And in my opinion, all extremely preterm children should have a psychoeducational assessment done once they are old enough. And this should be a detailed assessment that goes beyond looking at IQ or cognitive scores to include factors such as executive functions, working memory, processing speed, and attention. This can help identify children's strengths and weaknesses, plan educational strategies, and identify possible cognitive problems. Make sure that you partner with your kids' school and educators. You really need to work as a team and to listen what they're saying, including their observations or concerns about your child. Also be honest with them about your child's birth and medical history. If you have a child that hasn't started school yet, something to consider is their school start date. Depending on where you live, your child may be expected to start school a year earlier than they would have had they been born on time. So for example, in Quebec, the birth date cutoff for school is October 1st. Our daughter Marin was supposed to be born in December, but was actually born on September 21st, which means she started school a year earlier than she would have had she been born on her expected due date. So children born preterm may face this double disadvantage due to preterm birth and starting school a year early. And many preterm children, again, especially those who are born extremely preterm, could actually benefit from delayed school entry. We were initially concerned about this years ago, but all the professionals we spoke to suggested that Marin should start school based on her actual birthday. I think that the reasoning for this was that school provides an academically stimulating environment that some children may not have access to depending on their childcare situation or home life. But Marin was already attending a high quality daycare And we do wonder sometimes whether we should have gone with our gut and started her in school a year later. This leads to my next point, which is to ask lots of questions, particularly during follow-up at your hospital center about things like school start dates or referrals to specialists like psychoeducators. As I mentioned, there's a huge support gap once your child stops being followed in hospital. It can be a bit like falling off a cliff. Unfortunately, you can't rely on the education system to bridge the gap or put a fence around the cliff, so to speak. And this is not because of a lack of commitment or professionalism from teachers or other educational professionals, but because schools and school boards, at least in Quebec, and I suspect in many other provinces, are underfunded, lack specialists, and have a lot of other students who need support. So this means that you may very likely need to be proactive in finding a psychologist or other specialists, arranging for assessments, and also paying for them, which can be very expensive. Finally, take care of yourself. Having a preterm child in the NICU is a lonely and isolating experience, as we all know, because very few people understand what you are going through. Having a child that is struggling in school can also be isolating, especially if their peers and siblings are doing well. So don't hesitate to talk to people about your stresses or concerns, and recognize that your child is entitled to a high quality education, just like any other child, even if it's more work to get that education. So what are some resources that are out there? So Samantha Johnson, the psychologist that I previously mentioned, and her team in the UK have developed a great online resource called Preterm Birth Information for Educational Professionals. And this is just a shot of the screen. It's a series of short modules about preterm birth and different outcomes following preterm birth, as well as suggestions for ways in which teachers can support preterm children in the classroom. So this is an excellent resource for parents who might want some more information, and it's also something you could suggest to your child's teachers or school principal. Dr. Johnson recently also launched a campaign called Prem-Aware Schools to try to increase the level of awareness about prematurity amongst educators. It involves staff training, raising awareness about prematurity, and also encouraging feedback from parents about the support provided for their children. So unfortunately, this is only in the UK right now, but Fabi and I recently had a talk about maybe CPBF introducing something like this in a Canadian perspective. It's a straightforward, low-cost initiative that could have a big impact, and it's a great example of knowledge translation that's really lacking in this area. So in the future, I feel like we need to ask different research questions when we look at school and preterm children. There's a great quote from a recently published article that summarizes why focusing on things beyond neurodevelopmental outcomes and IQ are so important. The reporting of neurodevelopmental outcomes in cohort studies of infants born extremely preterm is variable and often incomplete. This may affect stakeholders' interpretation of study results, impair knowledge synthesis efforts, and limit evidence-based decision-making for this population. So I feel like in the future, we should be asking questions such as, how are preterm children currently being supported in schools? There's very, very little research or information about this. What is working for some preterm kids? We need research about what preterm children's strengths are. I'm sorry to report that this is an area that is completely under-researched. There should be more focus on executive function and social skills rather than IQ or cognitive scores. And we need to examine how academic difficulty in school may impact on the quality of life of preterm children, which is so important. Finally, there needs to be better communication between doctors and researchers and parents and teachers. And this starts with you encouraging and demanding this. So in summary, preterm children, particularly those who were born very or extremely preterm, are academically vulnerable. There has been little knowledge translation from academic research to schools. And this means that the parents of preterm children should be proactive about this even before their children start school. So thank you again for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And my email address is below. If you have any questions or want to contact me or have any feedback about this presentation, I would be thrilled to receive your emails. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. You can stop sharing your screen, but that was amazing. Always so nice hearing from you and your perspective and how much more we need to do in this field. So my question to you is, because that number is really high, 50% of children will have serious educational problems. That is a lot of children. So parents, when do they disclose to schools that their child was born extremely extremely preterm, because you see parents, maybe they just, they disclose that information earlier on, but once the child is in grade 4 or 5, they don't think that is relevant anymore. Should
Right.
be throughout the child's school life.
That's a good question. So I think that if you do disclose that information when your child starts school, I would hope anyway that that information would get passed on from teacher to teacher. So, if you tell the kindergarten teacher, it would be part of their file and it would go on to the other teachers as well. And again, I think this is just kind of to make sure that teachers are aware, and again, maybe are keeping an eye on your child. And I know the counter argument to that is that you don't necessarily want your child to be labeled. This is kind of the discussion my husband and I had, was, do we want people to be watching our kid overly, and every little thing, be concerned about it? But I sort of feel as an educator that teachers are pretty well trained, and they're going to keep an eye out for things that concern them. So I think it's better, to me, it would be better to not have her slip through the cracks and have teachers perhaps be more cognizant of what she's doing and her achievement and her participation and communication than less cognizant. So like I said, I would say for every parent, just to make sure, maybe when they have their child's first parent-teacher interviews in the fall, usually October, I think, to maybe just mention it to their child's teacher, because it's good information to have.
Okay, and then what kind of support schools can offer to the families besides the IP? Because the IP not always get followed through, and maybe doesn't look at every aspect of the child.
Right. So that's a good question. Again, I think that's really dependent on the school. I mean, it should be more consistent, but I don't think it necessarily is. So if your child does have an IEP, and even with some schools, particularly, it gets a little trickier in high school, because in order to get more support services, you really have to have an IEP, from my understanding, at least in Quebec. But in elementary school, children can get extra help with, we have in Quebec orthopedagogues that are educational professionals. So they can pull students out of class in groups to work on things like math problems, or communication skills, or reading skills, for example, reading comprehension. They can do it in the classroom with those students as well. They can provide suggestions as well, again, for references. Again, unfortunately in Quebec, you can't really rely the psychoeducational assessments that I was talking about. These are like quite big, sort of multi-day assessments that students can have done. Normally not till you're older in elementary school. But schools don't really offer those, at least not here. It's too much, it's too expensive, and they just don't have the staff in order to do that, or the specialists. But hopefully your school would have a list of potential psychoeducators or school psychologists that sort of do this on the side, that can provide that support for your child. So like I said, I think it really depends on where your child's in school, how many educational or orthopedagogues, for example, or speech language pathologists, for example, your school might have, how many other kids need support. So it's kind of a function of that. I think an IEP is a good place to start, because ideally we're actually just going through the IEP process with Marin this year. It gives kind of an overview of, again, your child's strengths and your child's weaknesses, and also things that they're going to try to focus on. So it's almost like a contract between the school and the parents. This is what we're going to try to do for your child. This is what we're aware of.
Okay, so a question coming from our live audience: how do you keep teachers aware without creating a complex for your child? Does it create a low self-esteem for the child?
It's a good question. I don't know that making teachers aware creates the low self-esteem. I would say that it's more, again, these sort of minor morbidities, which is kind of a yucky word to use, but these problems that come along with prematurity that might give them low self-esteem. So as I mentioned before, if a child is having trouble following conversations, it might be tough for them to understand what's going on. And I would say that that is something that would result maybe in low self-esteem. So I think that if a teacher, and I mean, all the teachers I know are consummate professionals, teachers aren't going to single out your child necessarily. I think them being aware of your child's preterm birth, and again, some of these issues that might come up with that, is so important, because then they can modify their teaching accordingly. So a great example, like I said, Marin, she has a bit of a stutter, and she's very quiet, and it makes her kind of nervous to participate in class, and her teacher is well aware of that. The school she goes to, they actually have the same teacher for 2 years. It's like grade 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the teacher knows her well, and she knows not to call on Marin 10 times in a class because she knows it makes her uncomfortable. So again, that's the kind of information that parents really need to tell the teacher, and it needs to be a partnership, because otherwise teachers don't know, like we just don't know this information.
Absolutely.
So the more, if that answered your question. I don't know, like I said, I would hope that what a teacher does would not cause low self-esteem in a student. If it is, that's very problematic. But I think if a teacher doesn't know, that's the problem, because then they're going to be doing things in class and have expectations that are going to result in the child not being able to succeed. So.
Absolutely. Another question, how do you link the health team with educators? They should work together with parents, building strong links with them.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, and again, I think it really depends on where your child is being followed. So I know when Marin was followed, I think they actually had sort of a pilot project, and I'm not sure whether it's still going on at St. Justine, where actually children, normally they would not be followed after 5, as I mentioned, but children were coming back as part of this pilot project to be followed and have a little bit of testing done once they started school, so that so that the neonatologist or the psychologist could kind of follow how they were doing at 6 or 7 instead of just 5, which is really important. So that was the time that we could ask questions of the doctor and things like that. But yeah, it's a big question. And I think, like I said, I think that this resource, something like this resource that Samantha Johnson developed, I think is so important, because this is a real area that's lacking. And I think depending on who your doctor is, some doctors might even be reluctant to even talk about this with parents, or not think it's important, because when your child is 3, there are bigger issues, like walking and talking and all of these behavior that are more important than school. But I was kind of thinking about it, and kids are in the NICU for 4 months, they're followed for 4 years, but then they have another 14 years in school that we still need to support them. And there seems to be really little support after this, initial 4 years of life. So
absolutely. Yeah. Rebecca, one last question. Can MRI help us in assessing the prognosis of these problems, or not necessarily? As I saw babies with normal MRI and they suffered a lot, and babies who MRI was not good, they are doing well.
Yes, no, I would say no to MRIs. I think that you have to treat the child, not what their brain looks like. Maybe in the future, if there's better interpretation of MRIs, perhaps, but I think it's, to my knowledge right now, there's not a strong enough link between MRI results and outcomes, or cognitive outcomes, or school-related outcomes. So I know that this is something that my husband and I published, or were co-authors on a paper on. I think really MRIs just do more to probably scare parents than anything else, and I'm not sure. I think probably money that MRIs cost and the interpretation of MRIs could probably be far better spent on, again, developing educational resources that will help teachers understand the behavior and academics of preterm children.
Absolutely. Rebecca, there's so many more questions that we could address today, but I'm going to bring you back next year, because our time is up right now. But thank you so much for joining us today. I'm hoping by March, April, you're back to give us more information on education, because it's such a big topic for families, and something new that we just started to explore not too many years ago. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And if anyone has questions, send me an email.
Yes, and we will share the links that we share as well on the comments below the screen. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And thank you, all of you, for joining us here today. I really want to thank AbbVie and Pampers for the ongoing support. And we have an excited announcement that from November 1st, in honor of Prematurity Awareness Month, this November, the whole month of November, Pampers is donating more than 200,000 diapers to support Canadian families and NICUs via the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. You can help support NICUs across Canada too. In November and December, every time you use the hashtag Pampers for Preemies, Pampers will donate 1 extra diapers to the Canadian ICUs. So you can join the conversation on your social media, and we're going to be posting on our social media channels as well, so you can engage in that conversation. And CPBF, it is a registered charity, and 100% of all donations received during this week will go to our educational programs for families. To donate, please go to CanadianPreemies.org. It takes only 3 minutes of your time, and you make a huge impact to the families that we serve. And